Welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. This episode, I'm joined by Albert from Vitalize Seed as we talk about his product Nitro Boost and soil health. All right, welcome back to the Am I Hunting Podcast. Thank you for listening. Basically, I was wanting to bring Al on sometime this spring to talk about Nitro Boost and his 1-2 system when it comes to food plot seed. And he just so happened to be like, well, I got an opening on Friday night. Let's go ahead and record. And we were able to knock this out for you. And it's so awesome to have Al on to talk about his products and Vitalize Seed and soil health. I mean, when I first started getting into soil health and thinking that I kind of, was getting the idea of, regenerative agriculture, the 6 fundamentals of soil health, I thought I was starting to think I knew something about it. And then I ended up talking with Al a little bit, and he kind of opened my eyes to just how little I knew about the, everything that's involved in good soil health, all the different pieces that can play into it. Ultimately, I was very excited about his seed company when they started up last year. I've told this story once before, but basically, I was starting to develop my own kind of seed blend and kind of doing already a 1-2 planting for the year, where I do like a spring, cover crop / summer food plot. And then I would follow that up with my, primary hunting food plot program for the fall. And I was kind of developing up my own little blend of trying to balance, different plants together and trying to get them to work together, kind of trying to follow that system of, a diverse blend working to improve the soil. Well, come find out, Albert has been, doing kind of the same thing for, several years now, developed his own blend that was, on par with what I was trying to achieve. So I was very excited to find out about Vitalize Seed and what Al has been doing. And, ultimately, I've decided to, go with his program. One of the hardest things for me was trying to figure out the different seed rates for all the different seeds in the blend. I mean, you're dealing with lots of different varieties of plants, and they all have a different, density or concentration of seed that you want per acre. And then you start mixing them all together. And it was racking my brain trying to figure it out. Well, Alice figured that out and partnering up with Jared from the Habitat podcast, and they released the product. So, and as you'll hear too, part of that blend is, basically is for that 2-part system is Nitro Boost in the spring and summertime, and then you have Carbon Load in the fall. Now that Nitro Boost again is going to really be, kind of what the name entails is to really get a buildup of nitrogen. So when you do your fall planting, which is usually pretty brassica or broadleaf base, that is going to have a big draw or need a lot of nitrogen. So what that 2-part system, you're kind of loading up on that nitrogen for that fall forage that you'll be needing. So then we get into talking about, the relationship between carbon and nitrogen in the soil, and how that operates with the plants and the microbes that are down in the soil. Basically you've got the plants, you've got the chemical makeup of your soil, and then you got the biological that really has to kind of all work together, and being sort of like a bit of a balance for it to really work for you. Not only for, to have a good, nutritious or well-growing food plot, but also if you're taking outside of the food plot world for gardening or agriculture, it all, you can take a lot of these same principles and put it into whatever you're trying to grow. But let's not hold up things any longer and go ahead and jump into the conversation with Albert with Vitalize Seed. Go ahead and do a quick introduction of yourself, of who you are and what it is that you do for anyone that may not know yet.
Yeah, Ty. Well, thanks for having me back, Albert. And I am the co-owner and founder of Vitalize Seed. My partner is Jared Van Hees of the Habitat podcast. And we started the company just over a year ago. and we're focused on wildlife, really diverse cover crop mixes with our 1-2 system, and soil health. Those are our three primary focuses. Sometimes all encompassing in one, or sometimes two out of the three, depending on who we're talking to in the grower's goals.
Gotcha. Okay, and then so you basically developed a kind of a 1-2 punch seed blend where you're looking at the basically like a spring to summer planting. That's basically well, it's dubbed Nitro Boost, of course, and then that complements a fall planting, which is carbon load, which gets basically through like a that's kind of it seems like that one's more so for the true food plot, building up mass production and foliage, or not foliage but forage, and getting that basically that good food source for especially for deer during the fall and throughout the winter. But again, with this being springtime, I'm sure you guys are catching a lot of the calls and doing a lot of sales of the Nitro Boost because that's the time of year for it. So, if you would go ahead and dive into, Nitro Boost, kind of what the goal is with that, and how you kind of develop that, and then how that works into with your or the carbon load, in regards to making that a system that works year round for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And really the whole goal is to follow the six soil health principles, and anybody listening can Google that. But one of them is reducing disturbance, keeping a living root growing, and so on and so forth, and trying to reduce inputs, right? And we wanted to come up with a system. Before we started the company, I always joke with people. I'm like, I saw a fertilizer bill for a spring planting one year. And I'm like, well, I wasn't married yet, but I said if I was, it wouldn't have lasted if I had to keep doing that, because it was like, $2,000 or 2,500. And this was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And it really got me started into thinking, okay, what can I do to generate more plant available food by using plants? So I wasn't really focused in the springtime on whitetails. Of course, as I did more research, I'm like, well, we can kind of knock out two birds with one stone, because a lot of the plants that we can use are also going to be super palatable for whitetail deer. Example, soybean, cowpeas, sun hemp, right? So there's several different varieties. So what we decided to do, after doing it on our own farms, I started writing some blogs and things like that on different forums and sharing kind of farm tours. And I started getting all these, comments and questions, be it on Facebook. Hey, I'd like to buy that mix off you. I'd like to buy that mix off you. And never really I'm like, well, I don't really sell it. I just make it for myself. And yeah. So long story short, there was enough demand there, and Jared with his platform had a lot of people, asking. He had me on as a guest or whatnot, and had a lot of people of interest, at least. We didn't really know where it was going to go, and we were fortunate to get some good distributors right off the bat who were willing to believe in us and dive in. So with that little bit of background, what we did is we basically took the mixes I've been using on my farm, or some variation thereof, and have really tried to fine tune them to make them better and better. But essentially, the spring feeds the fall, and the fall feeds the spring. And when I say that, I mean the soil. So you're feeding the soil the nutrients and making plant available nutrients available for that next planting. And how that works is really a main focus around carbon and nitrogen ratios. So if you think of like a compost pile, if it's just all leaves, it could sit there for a really, really long time and it doesn't break down because it's just too much carbon. But if it's some leaves and some house scraps and some green grass clippings, and it's mixed in thoroughly well, all of a sudden it's amazing what happens is the compost pile starts to generate heat, and it starts to break down quickly. And before long, that compost pile isn't just a compost pile anymore, right? It's soil. It's really nutrient dense compost or soil, and that's kind of the same idea that we're trying to implement on a field setting. So we work with a lot of food plotters. We work with a lot of small farmers. I'm actually on a podcast tomorrow with this really awesome lady out of southeastern Ohio who owns a flower farm. And they use our fall mix, like you mentioned, like kind of the deer hunter, right? Well, she saw the mix and she's like, I need to buy that. And they're using it as just cover cropping. And she absolutely loved it because of the cover and the above and below ground tonnage that it created. So we really focus on all different aspects of soil health and taking soil samples and stuff. But we use our system to try to minimize the number of synthetic inputs that one needs to put in the soil and maximize what we call, and this isn't something we made up, but we reference it often as nutrient cycling. And what that is in the spring, you have this mix of 13 different species, heavy on the legume side, but you still have your spring barley, your sunflower, your rape, et cetera. Buckwheat, so a couple broadleaves, a couple grass species, and then you have a bunch of legumes. And what that's doing is you're fixing a ton of nitrogen through the legume production and growth. You also have a ton of photosynthetic capture because we have a mixture of beans and lab and different types of beans for different height structures. One's a forage, one's a ag bean. You also have sorghum in there. I missed that on the first go. So you have all this different structure and vining structure and weaving in and out. It's creating it's like a solar panel, right? You're trying to capture every bit of sunlight that's hitting that field. That's really good for photosynthetic capture for microbes, right? Because if plants are photosynthesizing, good things are happening. The microbes are being fed. So what's happening too is we're fixing a ton of nitrogen. And that's prepping that ground for the fall because the fall we call carbon load, which kind of is a play on carbon and nitrogen ratios. And what that is, it's a much heavier carbon to nitrogen mix using, standard metrics to measure such. And it's a lot more grains, a lot of brassicas, and then you do have all of your annual clovers in there. But of course, those don't really pop until the following spring. You'll get some deer browse on them and such for food plotters. But what they do a really good job of is kind of aiding the soil coming out of spring in that, March timeframe when you start to get those kind of, you get a 50-degree day here and there. And that's where those annual clovers really shine because a lot of other stuff is still kind of in dormancy. The ryegrain, the winter wheat, and the clovers do a really good job both feeding deer through a very harsh time in the whitetails world because most of your woody browse has been browsed off in that April, March timeframe. Nothing's really green yet. So that's like one of the first things to green up. And then it'll actually carry you and build above ground biomass going into that next spring planting of Nitro Boost again. But you also have all these grains. So all these grains are much higher lignin filled or higher carbon to nitrogen crops. So what happens is the second year, so now you have terminated your Nitro Boost and it fixed all this nitrogen. You have all this plant above ground biomass. It's very fast growing, 60 to 80 days. You're creating biomass right now. And you're terminating it. You're planting your carbon load into it, however you want to plant. We could talk about that later. Planting into it, and that carbon load is absorbing all of those nutrients. And because those are lower carbon to nitrogen ratio plants in the Nitro Boost, they're breaking down quite rapidly to plants that need a lot of nutrients quite rapidly, right? So there's a very in tune system here from a recycling of nutrients perspective. So now you have turnips and radish and grains, et cetera, grabbing those nutrients and taking them up. So like I said, recycling those nutrients until the next planting. Now, when you go and terminate that carbon load, you're going to have a much heavier or more dense thatch because of the inherent nature of higher carbon and nitrogen filled plants, rye grain for talking purposes. Why that's important is because we're going in there with a solid mix of legumes to non, but they're going to produce enough nitrogen that's going to aid in the breakdown. One of the biggest problems that I see, and I'm really fortunate to get to pick a lot of farmers' brains. We just actually partnered with another podcast out of Eastern Pennsylvania, and the gentleman's a full-time agronomist, so we'll talk row crop agriculture a lot and bounce ideas off of each other. And one of the issues that we see often with cover cropping, which is what we're doing here, it's just basically cover crop on top of cover crop, is one is termination time, and really that's driven because of seeding rate. So like guys will go in and they'll put down, 300 or 400 pounds of rye because the more the better. Well, Not necessarily, because now you're letting that rye get really mature and then you're terminating it. And even if you just tried to plant soybeans into that heavy of a rye thatch, you don't have the nitrogen that the microbes need to cycle that much rye thatch. So again, it's going back to the compost pile example. You just have this kind of stagnant nature. And what ends up happening? Well, I'm going to have to get that tiller out and till all this up because there's no other way for me to get through this thatch. In actuality, a lot of times you could probably add some nitrogen fertilizer to it to help break it down. But that's not exactly the most like intuitive thought process unless you have a pretty good understanding of carbon and nitrogen ratios. So what we try to do is have super balanced systems that we figure that out for you. You plant one in the spring, you plant one in the fall, and you plant it again in the spring, and you plant it again in the fall, and you keep cycling those nutrients, and you keep fixing more nitrogen, and you keep solubilizing more phosphorus, and you keep solubilizing more potassium. And by doing so, you reduce your need for inputs. Um, and hopefully, through all my rambling, that was coherent enough for the listeners to kind of understand how that system works.
Yeah, no, I mean that's exactly why I love having especially having you as a guest to come on because you can articulate that process or explain it much better than I can. So that's fantastic. I mean, again,
Oh,
you
thank
you do
you.
such a great
Thank
job of explaining it and then making it to where you know someone like me who may not necessarily know all the science with it can follow along and be like, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's so funny that, again that you talk about the the that build up of too much thatch if you don't have that balanced out right. I know we talked about it last year. Basically, kind of when we were first talking about your product and whatnot, that I ran into that where I had so much thatch that I couldn't even plant because it was just laying on top and wasn't even getting soil contact. So, like you said, I ended up busting out a tiller, doing a light tillage just so I can get some soil to see contact. Um, and
So another thing too is that I'd like to mention is, um, so somebody might say, well, okay, that all makes sense, Al and Ty, but why not just use legumes in the spring and heavy grains in the fall, right? And maybe some brassicas. What happens is, and let's just talk nitrogen. This is just for ease of understanding, but a couple things. One, the more diversity we have, the better the microbes are going to do, right? So, some microbes like root exudate A, and when those microbes consume root exudate A, they have a reaction that then creates microbes B to have a reaction, which then creates microbe C to have a reaction. And when you have a multitude of this occurring throughout the landscape, throughout the soil profile, right, and you have all of these different chains of microbes, microbes are relatively simple organisms from like a DNA perspective. I just listened to this YouTube microbiologist speaking about this like 2 days ago. They're relatively simple. So in order to get those kind of chain reactions, or a common term thrown around here like symbiosis, right? In
yep.
order to get that to occur, you need multiple types of plant root structures and root exudation to maximize your soil biology, right? In fungal and bacterial networks or microbes. Also, when you look at like the NPK, which we're pretty much all familiar with, right? If you've ever bought Miracle-Gro or anything like that, that's the NPK model, which is a very good one. And I love looking at soil tests. I look at probably 1,000 a year. And I think they're super important to do. And we can talk about that. But let's just talk nitrogen. Nitrogen is a leachable nutrient. I think everybody knows that. And there's variability in that depending on soil type, rainfall, et cetera. But in general, nitrogen is a leachable nutrient, whether it's going to go back into the atmosphere or if it's going to leach through the soil profile when it gets to nitrate. So if anybody's interested in this, you can Google the nitrogen cycle. And there's a bunch of diagrams, and it shows whether it comes out the back end of a cow and it's manure, how then it's broken down and eventually becomes nitrate, or if it's in the air, and then of course it goes through nitrification through bacteria, through root nodulation, and then it turns into nitrate, right? So at end, it ends up being nitrate in most situations. Now, what's interesting about that is if you only plant legumes, and let's just for talking purposes say there's 100 pounds of available nitrate in 6 inches. And let's say those legumes, they need a little bit, right? They need a little bit to get started as a young seedling. Maybe they take 20 pounds of that nitrate that's there. What happens to the rest of it that's just sitting there in that 6 inches of soil. You're going to hope that it's there for your brassicas the next fall, and then you're going to have to likely fertilize again. Like what's going to, and now your brassicas and ryegrain stuff, they work their tails off to have taken up all that nitrogen that you now they're decomposing, and and you're thinking this is great. Well, it is for the P and the K likely, because this monoculture beans are going to take it up. But all that other nitrogen there, what happens to it? Just slips out of the soil. So that's why, like, we have hybrid sorghum. That's why we have sunflowers. That's why we have spring barley, because those plants are going to then grab that nitrogen that your legumes don't need. So again, what are we doing? We're keeping nitrogen in the cycle. It's the same idea. It's the recycling of nutrients, because our plants, especially if you're using our system, the 1-2 system, they work their tails off in the spring to fix all that nitrogen. And then we planted everything in the fall, and those plants work their tails off to solubilize more PK, micros, et cetera, and use up that nitrogen that we had previously fixed. We don't want to let that all slip out of our system. So there's a method to the madness there, far beyond just diversity in root structures, which is a beautiful thing, and it's great to have deep tap roots and such, but it's something to keep in mind as to how we continue to keep the nutrients in the cycle from one to the next.
Yeah. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I know that, if I remember correctly, a good carbon to nitrogen ratio is 24 to 1. So it's 24 carbon to 1 nitrogen essentially. And that, if that gets out of balance, so if your carbon's way too high, then a lot of those microbes will end up, I guess, again, I don't know the true science of it, but they'll actually start taking nitrogen and using that because it's trying to, I guess, go after or break down that carbon. So it kind of like binds up your nitrogen to where it's not accessible anymore because of that carbon to ratios. And then the opposite can happen if your nitrogen is too high. Then those microbes start going after your carbon and breaking down your organic matter in that regard. Again, I don't know exactly the whole process of how it looks like, but I kind of know that that's an outcome that can happen. I can see that being so. If you did all legumes in the spring, and then all your brassicas or broadleaves or something like that, that you're just going to keep swinging back and forth where you don't get really good balance with that.
100% right. So yeah, what happens is, like, if you have just too much carbon and not enough nitrogen, your microbes will starve.
Gotcha.
They need, think of nitrogen as the protein and carbon as the carbohydrate or sugar. And you need that balance. So that's why you have what they call nutrient tie-up.
Okay. Yeah.
If it's too heavy of carbon, a good example that most people, at least in the Midwest, can probably envision is when you see corn harvested. After a corn harvest, a lot of times you just see this incredible amount of thatch laying on top of a cornfield. And what happens there is that all that stalk is holding a ton of nutrients. And that's why a lot of farmers, you can Google this as well, fall time nitrogen applications. People go, why are they spreading nitrogen in November? Doesn't make any sense. What are they fertilizing in November? The reason they're fertilizing in November is because they're working to try to break down that thatch, or they're doing fall tillage operations in order to add oxygen to the system to help the micropopulation expand so that it can break down that thatch. Because without that tie, what happens, you just have total nutrient tie-up. In a farmer situation, you're like, hey, I got to pay the mortgage here. We got to make sure there is no tie up here. We got to get ready to go. Obviously, in a fruit plot or garden setting, it's still, maybe not equally as frustrating, but still very frustrating, because you're sitting here scratching your head going, I thought I did everything right. Why are things struggling to get nutrients? Well, it's because that ratio was out of whack. On the inverse of that, you're 100% right. So even when, let's just say you're doing a brassica monoculture, and let's say that those brassicas really only need 50 units of N per acre, and you figure, the more the better, you're going to throw down 300 units of N. Likely what's happened, one, you're probably going to waste money through volatilization of the nitrogen, just for, again, I mean, we can talk other nutrients, but just I think nitrogen's most recognizable one. But one, wasting money through volatilization, and then two, exactly what you mentioned. These microbes, excuse me, are yeah, they're like little animals. I guess I can use that analogy, but they're hungry, and now they've had this nitrogen. Now they're like, man, I need to balance this out. I've had all this nitrogen. Where's my carbon? And if there's not a carbon source there, you can mine your organic matter out of your soils.
Yep.
There's also other negative impacts of over fertilization. Like, for example, it's like if you gave a bodybuilder, right? That's a good analogy. They use steroids, or at least some of them do. Not trying to give a blanket statement against the bodybuilding community, I guess, but you know what I mean. Like if they're a steroid user, your body stops producing testosterone. Well, if you're only allowing your plants to be force fed, synthetic forms of nitrogen, again, for talking purposes, this is proven they do not communicate with, and they do not grow the roots, and they do not communicate with the microbiome or microbial system below ground in an optimum way. And why? Because they have it right there. It's the same way a guy who's given steroids after steroids after steroids, their body stops producing testosterone unless they're monitored by a doctor and things are done right. Well, it's the same idea. So a lot of times with NP and K, you can get by with a lot less than people realize.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I know I went to a seminar just this over the winter, and they were talking, basically kind of talking about soil health and the microbes and whatnot, and they brought up a good point where a lot of people are, especially phosphorus, like everyone always hears phosphorus is good, phosphorus, 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 and that a lot of applications, even like they talked about agriculture, people's yards, their home gardens, even like golf courses and whatnot. They're just pumping so much phosphorus in there that it's tying everything up where it's basically making it to where a lot of the other nutrients aren't being accessible because that phosphorus is so high it's caused that imbalance. Quite similar to like if you have that imbalance with the carbon and nitrogen, basically the system kind of gets bogged down because it's trying to deal with all that phosphorus.
Oh, absolutely, Ty. I mean, I've seen crazy high this year, especially phosphorus numbers on some soil tests. And I can like immediately, and the people are like, how did you know that? I'm like, well, did you put phosphorus fertilizer down like the last couple of years? And also, have you used dolomite limestone? Because your magnesium and your phosphorus are like through the roof, and they're, how did you know that? I'm like, because here, and we have a phone call. I try to explain it to them. And the thing about phosphorus is, also is that it's really immobile in the soil, or at least most types of phosphorus are. So, like if you're a farmer and you're running it in like say a 2x2, on a planter, so it's 2 inches in front and 2 inches to the side or something like that of your soybeans. Well, that's like right in the root zone, right? You're placing those nutrients, be it phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, right in the root zone, or maybe you're banding it, or maybe it's a foliar drip, but you're putting it darn near on the seed. When you're talking food plotting or gardening and you're talking broadcasts and things, there's a good chance that a lot of it is getting wasted anyways. And that comes into, well, if you're going to put it down, do you want to work it in with tillage? Well, if that's the case, I would recommend doing really get strategic on your soil test so you really know what you're getting. Try to limit as many variables as you can, and then do that maybe once every like 4 or 5 years. Use that light tillage to work those in. But in most cases, in most soils that I've seen, you can let your biology. There's a ton of phosphorus in the soils. Dr. Christine Jones, The Phosphorus Paradox, is a great listen for anybody that's interested. You can unlock an incredible amount in your soils. I'll give you a quick example. So last year we grew our Nitro Boost, and right before I terminated it, I took tissue samples, 2 different fields about a half a mile apart on the farm, and what I was able to do is look at NPK, micros, calcium, etc., and nitrogen. That those plants had assimilated about 45 pounds per acre of nitrogen. In phosphorus, they had assimilated about 25 pounds to the acre of phosphorus. And these are about a half a mile apart, totally different CECs, different organic matters, and they were like within a pound or two of each particular unit, or yeah, unit's fine. And then potassium, and it was 85 pounds to the acre of potassium was uptake. Neither one of those fields has ever had an ounce of fertilizer other than lime. So if you count lime, full transparency, I put lime now, but neither one of those fields has had an ounce of fertilizer on them. And that's what was a symbol. So where did it come from? It came from microbes. It came from biology, came from fungal networks. That was in the soil. It
Right.
just needed to be solubilized. That is the balance. That is the number one, in my opinion, that's one of the number one things we need to do is make nutrients plant available through solubilizing them. And what we need to work on is how do we solubilize them? Well, through diversity, through increasing organic matter, through reducing disturbance, through managing deer browse, et cetera.
Yep. Yeah, and that again that plays into kind of the next big part that I've learned more so is that it's not necessarily your macronutrients, your micronutrients, and then your pH. It comes down to that living soil or those microbes in the soil that you just kind of touched base on, where they are the ones that are going to make a lot of those nutrients available for the plant, and they're extremely good at being able to pull like those mineral you know those nutrients that are trapped in mineral or in the soil that a plant just can't do anything with. They're really good at being able to taking those nutrients, kind of do their thing with them to make it to where, like you said, to where a plant can actually utilize it, either by that microbe dying or decaying or getting or releasing that mineral, or being consumed by another type of microbe or whatnot, and then the plant can take that up and utilize it.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of doing soil tests. And I always look at it like twofold is we want to look at, your pH, and then, organic matter is obviously nice to have, kind of know where you're starting at. But I like to look at it like chemical structure of our soil. And then how can we optimize that, and then how do we optimize our biological structure? And the biological structure is our 1-2 system, right? We got diverse mixes, or if somebody's doing it themselves, right? It's that idea of maximizing diversity to your comfort level, reducing tillage, reducing herbicide use, all of that. That's all beautiful. That leads itself to biological processes. But I still think that we need to pay attention to the chemical structure of the soil, so that when you're looking at your pH and you're looking at the CEC of your soil and you're making those sound decisions as to, okay, I'm going to spend 100, 200, 1,000, 2 grand, whatever it is on lime for this year and next year, and hopefully that'll carry me through several years. What's the best lime for my soil type, right? Is it a high cal lime? Maybe I can't get a high cal lime. Do I need to do some dolomite lime, and then do I need to follow up in 6 months with the gypsum to get my calcium base saturations up? Maybe I have really sandy soils. Do I need to focus more on dolomite lime so I get my magnesium to be a little bit tighter on that soil to give it a little bit more chemical structure, and then let my biology and the fungal networks and the biotic glues such as glomalin that's produced by fungal networks help to hold and aggregate, right? Fancy word for hold together that soil structure. So if you really break it down and try to make it more simple, it's like think chemical, biological, and how do we mesh those two together and give us that sound program and structure. And that's why it's like in in a system that's very sandy soils, let's say, it's okay to have your magnesium a little bit higher than say in a system with like really heavy soils. Maybe we don't want our magnesium as high because we want more calcium to add porosity. And that can 90% of the time, that can be simply managed by adjusting your pH, but then taking an extra 5 minutes to look at your base saturations and then make that decision based on that for your lime choice.
Yep. Yeah, I that was actually I'm so glad that we got into this part of the discussion because I was just thinking about that because I was just watching a short little seminar when they were talking about like, especially for like the heavy clay soils, adding that calcium, and it kind of like, again, not knowing the true science behind it, but basically it separates that those how clay lays on top of each other. Basically, it stacks, and by that calcium, it separates that clay or those clay particles up a little bit, giving it space and loosening those soils up, towards not dealing with that just a sheer clay layer. It gives it some space for other things to get in there. Um,
It's exactly right. So you know what a so Ag PhD Radio is an awesome um, YouTube and podcast. They've been around for like 20 years. Huge farmers. It's very geared toward agriculture. I think they do it like a radio show. So it's like every day. But the way they explain it in the one, and it's been maybe a year. So if I butcher this, I apologize. But it's something close to this. Like think of calcium as a basketball and think of magnesium as a golf ball. So between your layers of, clay and silt and rock and sand and the things that soil are made up of, if you have so much magnesium, you just have these tiny little golf balls between your layers are going to be really tight, right? It's going to create this really tight structure, which is okay. But if it's a heavily clay dominated soil, it's going to make something that's already inherently tight very tight, right? And that's where a lot of times guys say, oh, I mean, I've even seen guys with low CE soils say, I have a compaction issue. And like most of the time I go, let me see your soil test. And their magnesium is like through the roof and into the next county. And it's because they just have been putting too much dolomite lime down and never having any additional calcium. It's also why there are products out there that are liquid calcium products, and somebody will, maybe it's presented as a liquid lime or something. We could go down that rabbit hole as to how lime truly works, but we don't necessarily have to. But there's very true, and people will get very defensive of this, right? They'll get on forums and say, that's not a real lime product. But what you can't argue with is the positive response people are having, Ty. And what is the reason that they're having this positive response? Well, it's because in many soils, there's just not enough solubilized calcium, or at least rapidly available. So when you go in, whether it's altering the pH or not, that doesn't really matter. What's happening though is you're feeding these plants a solubilized calcium in a situation where maybe magnesium's through the roof and these plants are starving for calcium. So you didn't get this great plant growth because you changed the pH rapidly with a liquid product. What you did do though is you got this really great plant growth because you hit it with a liquid soluble calcium, right? So that's where I think that it can pay, a few more dollars for a soil test that gives you base saturations. There are some Google apps you can use where you can plug in stuff, but you can really make a lot of sound decisions and understand, man, where am I from a soil perspective by having those numbers on there. And it makes a huge difference from a soil structures perspective.
Yeah, yep. And again, I think kind of like what you're just saying. I thought I was a little mistaken thinking that, because originally I thought the calcium would help, like a bind up or kind of glue together a light soil, but it's magnesium you said then that is for a light soil.
Yeah, you
More
still
so.
want calcium in your soil, of course, but you want like a higher percentage of not higher than calcium, but you want a higher percentage of magnesium relative to that soil type than if it was a heavier soil type, right? So maybe in a real light soil you can go 20 to maybe even 25% magnesium. Your calcium you're still going to want up there 60 to 70% somewhere in there, and your potassium can be quite a bit higher too. Now, what you will see on there is you'll see hydrogen, which is that's your acidity, right? So if hydrogen's on there in a large percentage, then I can guarantee you your pH is low. So as you add the right lime source, calcitic or dolomitic, you'll see your hydrogen get bumped off. Well, something has to take that parking spot. So if it's dolomite lime, your magnesium is going to take that parking spot, right? In most cases. If it's a high cal lime, your calcium will. So that's what's important to pay attention, because calcium, think of calcium as adding porosity. So it's going to make your soil in heavy soils think of like porosity as like a sponge. But obviously in sandy soils, we don't need any more porosity. It's already really porous. It's like catching rainwater with a screen. So we want to add some structure to it.
Yep. And then, since we're on the topic of the soil structure and the aggregates and whatnot, you can use the chemical side, like you said, using magnesium to help a lighter soil, calcium for a heavier soil. But then also you've got, again, we go back to the biology of the microbes, and those can clump together. You know, from my understanding, like a lot of the bacteria will kind of group together, and then a lot of the fungi will group with that and create kind of its own aggregate. I think is the right word, where it kind of glues the soil together as well, with the biology side as well.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, both of them, the both of those things happen. So like fungal networks will release what's called glomalin, and there's a term for the bacterial uh, release, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. Um, but yeah, basically it's like a little glue that like literally particles of soil will like hold itself to. It's like it makes itself like a little dome. And that's why, the microbes will communicate straightly through the plants. And um, Dr. James White does the rhizophagy cycle. And basically what that talks about is that, in living plants, and the microbe communication going to the roots, even up into the plants, in some cases, the plants consuming the microbes for food,
Yep.
right? And then also in other times where the microbes will then come back out of the plants and then take some of those communications back to their own microbial communities. Again, for simplistic terms, microbial community A. And then that tells them, hey, we need more potassium, right? And it's super simplified. It's really, really complicated science that obviously a PhD has been working on for years. But at the high level, that's some of the things that are occurring. And when you have all of that happening in these different, like Ray Archuleta does a really nice job. He just calls them biotic glues.
Yeah.
So think of, biological glues. And that's all you really need to know. So you pull a root out of the soil, and are your roots, are they naked, or it's just like just a plain naked root? That's not a really good sign of soil aggregation or biological aggregation, because that root should have soil adhered to it. And that's just a simple sign of seeing like, wow, what's creating something's creating that, right? That plant just isn't doing that all by its own. And that's that communication of biology, going there, and that fungal networks and hyphae literally communicating and growing into and within the roots, which is a really cool process to learn about.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'm so happy that you brought that up, because yeah, that was one thing we learned in that little seminar, is that, like, yeah, some of the bacteria, I believe it's bacteria, will actually get absorbed by a plant into the root system. It'll do its communication. It'll trade off whatever it's looking for, and then that bacteria will either, I think some of it will either get consumed by the plant, or like you said, some of it gets released back out with whatever that bacteria wanted and puts it back into the soil again. So yeah, it's amazing how, again, like you said, those plants are built to work with those microbes, in exchange of trying to make everything much better.
Well, and you can see why what we were talking about earlier, that if you reduce your microbial communications by over using synthetic fertilizer or disrupting your microbial systems, in a large way, right? Where your plants can't communicate anymore because they're not overly healthy, and they're not having strong root exudates, which is going to then promote or farm, if you will, the microbes. So if you don't have that, you don't get to experience, and your plants don't get to experience all of those other things, which is obviously detrimental to the plants. When plants do experience those things, and they are taking up microbes and they are consuming them, and they are having less stress from a protein conversion perspective of those microbes, there's a lot of science also that shows they'll have higher Brix readings. And there's direct relationships to higher Brix readings to better pest resistance. which is really amazing, where they have done studies. And again, these are PhDs, super brilliant people. They're doing studies where, they'll have these really high Brix rating plants, and they have a Japanese beetle come in and try to consume it. And it's a plant that maybe they would normally consume. And all of a sudden they notice the plants with the higher Brix levels that were grown in really fertile, high microbial systems are able to excrete like an acid, for lack of, my understanding. But basically, where that Japanese beetle bites into it, and it's like, whoa, that was bitter. Don't want that, and it leaves, and it goes and finds a less healthy plant,
Yep.
and that's all done through that microbial system. Again, Dr. James White is, for anybody interested, the rhizophagy cycle is a really, really good listen.
Yep. Yeah. Again, you keep beating me to all the punch. Like I was just gonna thinking about, kind of closing towards the end of talking about bricks, because again, bricks is essentially like the nutrient density or the health of the plant, correct?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times guys will say it's a sugar reading or carbohydrate reading, of the fruit or of the leaf matter. I think you can do a little bit more involved testing if you want to do like sap analysis or something like that. I have done some tissue sampling. I do a lot of cover crop tissue sampling. I haven't done the sap analysis at this point, but you can do Brix readings with a refractometer. I mean, you can buy one off Amazon for like $20, and it uses sunlight, and they give you a little dropper and you put it on there, and it'll give you a rough reading, 4, 8, 10, 14, so on and so forth. So pretty cool, especially for home gardeners and stuff. If you want to check the Brix of your cherry tomatoes, you can do that right at home there in your backyard.
Yeah, yeah, because that was one thing that they talked about. Again, the thing I just learned over the winter is that like having that higher bricks is going to make it more resistant to, um, like you said, especially certain insects. Also, a little bit more disease resistant. So especially if you're a farmer or doing orchards or anything like that, like it's going to help protect your plants from the insects or disease. By having a nicer, healthier plant that has all the nutrients it needs to be the healthiest it can be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's where, um, I don't want people to think like I'm totally anti-amendments. I'm not at all. I'm just trying to give you my best job of explaining kind of the backgrounds of the systems. But I think the best thing that we can do for all of us, right? Like I do it religiously, is make sure that we're taking consistent soil samples. And then if we are going to add amendments, um, consider our options. Do we want to, maybe we can add a natural, organic foliar spray, and maybe that even has some microbes in it or food for microbes, or some of the things we were talking about before we started, a compost tea. There are some really, excuse me, great products out there that go a lot further than just, your triple 13,
Yep.
a heavy salt based fertilizer. There's a lot of really good products out there that you can consider, um, foliar applying, doing a root, if you're planting an apple tree, doing a root dip. That's something I do with my tomatoes a lot, is use, fungal or bacterial, when I'm transplanting, to help reduce transplant shock and just give them that additional root, structure. Anybody who's growing tomatoes knows you start them from seed, and you probably transplant them at least once, then maybe even a second time, and then eventually you get to plant them in the ground. And tomatoes are a unique plant because you can take them and plant them really, really deep, and they just basically all of that becomes roots. Whereas like pepper or something, you're not going to plant that deep, because it's more of a stalk type species. But tomatoes are unique in that you can literally plant them up to their neck in soil, and they'll just kind of get fatter and a really nice stalk and grow up. So when you transplant them, it's a really good tip. So if you're adding a mycorrhizal fungi or bacteria to that, to help establish stronger root systems and a healthier plant, even in that potting soil, or trees, you can do the same thing. It's like a little insurance policy, and that's a biological addition, right? If you want to foliar spray, something I've used in my garden with pretty good responses has been like fish hydrolysate. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's like, it's
Mm-mm.
stinky, but it's like basically from, like the fish industry, like they grind up and process it's all natural, right? So like, let's say they cut the fish up for the parts that we're going to eat, and then there's all this other part. It's like, well, what are we going to do with that? Well, they process that all up. And another common one's like bone meal or blood meal, which is taken from similar processes, and it's like natural. and it's processed, and then you can use that to feed your plants. And those are all cool. Again, too much of a good thing is not always a good thing. So
Right.
you don't want to overdo it. But those are some just alternative options I thought I'd throw out there, because there are some soils, Ty, I'll tell you, that are really degraded. And we have an absolutely fantastic program, our 1-2 system, but I want people to be successful. And if their soils, I looked at one just a day or two ago, they had less than 1% organic matter and like a 1 or 2 CEC soil. So like basically Daytona beach sand. That's a really, there's just not much there. So do I think that we need to go in and haul topsoil? No, but I think we do. We probably are going to have to foliar feed those plants the first maybe few years to generate the above ground and below ground biomass. Maybe use fungal inoculants, maybe use bacterial inoculants to get that population established to then allow a system to run, right? And that's a pretty extreme example. I don't see
Right.
that often, but I just want to kind of explain, as we wrap up, a little bit more about really take the time, soil test, and get yourself in a position where you feel confident with a plan to attack. And don't look at it year one. Year one, we're just going to look at it like 1, 2, 3 years. Where would I like to see this pH? Where would I like to see, this base saturations over the next 1, 2, and 3 years?
Yep. Now, so with you talking about, like you said, the inoculant, again, it was so funny that I was just kind of going through some social media, just kind of wasting some time until we had a chance to talk, and all of a sudden I see a video pop up where you're announcing a new product of just that thing, where it's I think you said it's more so for a fungal inoculant, correct? Where it's just gonna give the kind of give those microbes and whatnot a little bit of a boost around that plant to help that plant, right off the get go. So if you would go ahead and talk about that a little bit more, and let's talk about that new product, and kind of
Yeah,
what the
thanks,
benefit
Ty.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, so we partnered with Taneo Biologics. They're a company out of Washington State, and I've been following them for a long time, and actually got to talk to I think he was the CEO or president. I forget his exact title now, but really brilliant biologist. Um, and I've been speaking. Obviously, we partner with Ward Labs, and I spoke to people over there for some time about different biological inoculants. Nothing specific to a brand, but just what are your thoughts and stuff. And it seems pretty homogeneous throughout the industry, the agricultural industry. Like, yeah, there's merit to this. There's a lot of really great companies out there. John Kempf from AEA, he does the Regenerative Agriculture podcast. He has a bunch of biological products and primers that they've been using for many years with great success. So it seems like it's a pretty agreed upon understanding. So I've been trying some of these for the last, I would say, maybe year or so. And honestly, mostly for my own gardening type of situation. And what really intrigued me by it was I was seeing, positive results. And, obviously getting the mycorrhizal fungi aspect and having, we have 2 different products. One is the Spectrum Plus Myco, they call it. It's like 20 different strands of various rhizobacteria. So, helps with nitrogen fixation, helps with nutrient cycling, all of those type of things. It's all those good bacteria that you want, and you want to have them right there on your roots. And then, of course, there's mycorrhizal fungi, and there's a couple different strands that are in that particular powder. So I use it a lot on transplanting tomatoes. I transplant them, I put a little bit of the powder, I spray a little bit of water, put the tomato in there, and seal it up, right? And it's been working really well. The other product is called Micro 5000, which again has a ton of bacteria. Then it also has a bunch of micronutrients, which is something that we see, especially like you were saying earlier. You have a lot of soils with so much phosphorus, such an abundance of phosphorus, and nobody's looked at the zinc levels in forever, and that can have a real detriment on yield, or in whitetail's case, just appearance, right? Because your zinc is all tied up, and those micronutrients, they're normally not the first one we look at, but they can impact us, especially if it's the lowest hole in the bucket.
Yep.
So having that product, and there's what's cool about the Micro 5000, it also has a biological component to it as well. Just to help further stimulate that biology. So both those products, what really intrigued me about them is they come in a small pack. So they're like a pound, maybe a little bit, maybe half a pound of powder, and that covers up to an acre. The micro 5000 is actually about 12 ounces, and that covers, so it's a little less than a pound. I think it's 12 ounces. And that covers up to 2 acres. So it's super potent stuff. And what's neat about it from a food plotting perspective is you can actually do what they call seed treatment. So you can put this powder right on the seed and mix it in. You can do, there's water soluble, so you can solubilize it and then spray it on foliarly. Um, and I'm trying to think if there's, oh, and then of course the last one would be the root dip, which would be more for trees or like transplanting, tomatoes or peppers or whatnot. But that's where you put it in the water and solubilize it in the water, agitate the water, make sure it's totally dissolved. And then you're dipping the plant in there and letting it soak for, 10, 15 minutes or so. And then putting that plant into the hole or into its final resting place, if you will. So there's a couple different ways you can do it. Of course, if you're planting a tree, you could just put it straight into the hole, add a little bit of water, put the tree in there, etc. So those are the ways that they can be used. They come in a little packet, and that way you're not hauling around water. You get to your property, or you get to where you want to use it, then you can mix it up yourself, which is kind of nice too, because you're not dealing with like carrying 30 jugs of water all around.
Gotcha. Um, yeah, I mean, it was so funny that I was thinking about that, and I was going to talk to you about the compost tea, or the compost extract. With basically what that is, I'm not going to make you have to explain it all, but basically it's a solution that you kind of take some compost, you mix it in with water, and you add a bunch of oxygen to it, and it basically grows a bunch of bacteria, basically good microbacteria, and then you would either put that on on your plants, right on the foliage, or you put it on your soil to kind of help boost up some microbes for your soil. Extract's a little bit different. It's basically you kind of grow those bacterial microbes, especially, and then they're kind of more in a dormant phase, so they you don't need as much. They're not as volatile to where they're gonna start eating up all the oxygen, and it's a little bit, it basically they're sitting dormant, and then they kind of wake up once they're in the soil and the soil temperatures get right for them and everything like that. Um, the same idea, kind of, if you don't have that biology, it helps boost it for you. Again, different techniques on different applications, of course, but that's kind of what that idea was. Uh,
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, because think of it like if you're spraying something that's dormant, even if you have biology that's already there and you're spraying something like a compost tea, which is going to be somewhat of a food source, and even, some of your bacteria, let's say it lives, even if it doesn't, as you're giving this the biology that's there, this food source, right? It's going to be consuming it, and it's going to be propagating rapidly. So you're, in a way, even if you're indirectly um, establishing, your microbial system, you're going to increase the population just by adding that food source. Now, too much of a good thing isn't a good thing,
right.
right? As we said before, because you need to make sure that those microbes that you're increasing have a food source, because we don't want to mine our organic matter. But it's still a very, very cool process and thing that we can do with our systems.
Yep. Yep. And then again, kind of just to kind of bring this back, back around and bring it home to everyone. Again, the big thing that I ended up, really starting to look into the soil health movement, trying to come up with a better system, similar to what you've created with the different, plant mixes that are going to, do that nutrient cycling. Part of that is, for one, I was trying to find a cheaper, easier way to, grow food plots and, improve soil health. And then the other was, you know, basically trying to have a healthier plant for deer and wildlife to have. And, that whole process with the, the six foundations of soil health, your plant, basically the mix that you came up with, and or, any type of mix that is looking for soil regeneration, or I guess soil regeneration, not quite the right word, but soil health, I guess I should say. Ultimately, it's gonna, if you're doing it right and are patient with it, using some of those tricks that you can kind of boost it and kind of speed it along a little bit, you're gonna end up saving more on having to do inputs. You're gonna have healthier plants. For me on the food plot side, that's going to be more nutrient, food for the deer and wildlife, healthier deer, bigger antlers, that type of stuff that could be an outcome of that. And then even like in the just in the like a garden aspect or agriculture, if you have farmers that are not having to put so much into inputs, they're going to do better off, you know as a farmer. They're going to be growing better plants, which are going to be healthier for the consumer, when we buy it in the grocery store and whatnot, or even that local farmer just doing their own garden. It comes down to that, those that crop that you grow, or those plants that you're growing in the garden, are going to be more nutritious. And they talk about, even the, especially like the fruit that they've done a lot of studies on. The fruit is going to have more sugar in it. It's going to be more flavorful and be more nutritious. They were actually talking about, there's a group that's trying to come up with an app where they do a breakdown of different produce, and they can actually look at the difference between, basically high nutrient. I think the one example they did was carrots, where you have one carrot that was grown, that's high in nutrient, compared to another carrot that was grown, with low nutrient. And it was like the nutrient content of that one carrot equaled 200 of another carrot that, basically had poor nutrient content. So by boosting that, I mean, you're getting far more beneficial food, on the consumer side.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, it really is amazing. Some of the science that's coming out and the opportunities that arise, especially for us humans. What are we going to be eating and how are we going to be able to make those choices? Right there at the grocery store.
Yeah.
Which is really exciting. But yeah, I mean, listen, you can do a lot with a little. I think that the world record corn is over 600 bushel per acre. It's done by a regenerative agriculture farmer, and I think he's in North or South Carolina. Um, and he's doing cover cropping. He fertilizes, but he's cut his typical N down tremendously. He's adding a ton of biological inoculants and stimulants to help. He's hyper focused on his below ground biology, and he grew over 600 bushel corn on non-Midwestern soils. So there's definitely something to it, but it's not an overnight fix. And it's something, it's a process. That's why we call it, it's a system. We call it our 1-2 system. It's a process, and it's a lot of fun. And I tell people, keep pulling soil samples, keep monitoring things, keep adjusting seeding rates and whatnot, because every single property is different.
Yep. Yep. And again, I mean, I know you always talk about, I mean, I think almost every video you talk about a soil sample, know what's going on, so that way you know what, amendments or what changes you have to make the system better. So, yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Uh, All right, man. Well, I think we covered basically everything I was wanting to touch on. I mean, is there anything else that you wanted to close out with, or something that you think, people need to know, or that we missed talking about?
No, I don't. I mean, the only thing I would say is, don't get too eager to plant, guys. Wait till the soil temps get to be about 55 and climbing. You want to kind of catch it as it's ramping up. I tell people, try to catch that upward trajectory. That way, if you have your seed in the ground right before that kind of hits that 60-degree temperature, but it's on that way, maybe you beat some of them weeds out of the ground, specifically with spring planting. So if you can get in that, and kind of catch that upward wave. But other than that, no, Ty, thanks so much for having me and letting me ramble on here. And for all the people listening, I appreciate it. And yeah, if you'd like to check us out, vitalizeseed.com. If you have questions, if you're interested or not, interested in our products and just want to talk soils, I love chatting with people. So reach out, and I'm happy to try to help.
All right, man. Well, thank you again for coming on. Again, you are a wealth of knowledge when it comes to, you know, with all of this, with soil health and how to make the system work. And like you said, even when if you're a food plotter, if you're a farmer, or if you're just growing your own little garden, a lot of these stuff that you talk about applies to all those aspects. So it's it's exciting to see, especially too with the growing people are kind of catching on and, getting on board with it.
Yeah, it's a little overwhelming sometimes. It's been a real blessing to talk to so many great people and help so many people and bounce ideas off guys who are, like I said, agronomists, or full-time huge farmers, and they're calling like, hey, what do you think about this or that? Or hey, and it's humbling, but it's also really exciting just to see that movement. And the last thing I guess I will say is there's a lot of pressure out there to dive in to the soil health movement or regenerative, both feet. And I like to always tell people, and I say it in a lot of videos, and it probably gets, beaten like a dead horse, but any step towards soil conservation is a step in the right direction. So if you want to till because it was your grandpa's tiller and it just means something to you, that's all right. But just recognize what it's doing in that it's probably going to upset some fungal networks. So if you're going to till, don't bury the tiller. Can you till at a half inch? Get the tiller out, get on the tractor, put on George Strait radio. You can do the things you want to do, but just do it at a half inch instead of 6 inches. Try to leave a little bit of thatch, conservation tillage, right? Try to leave some thatch coverage after the fact. And then try to use really diverse mixes, and try to reduce your need for synthetic inputs and maybe use a fish hydrolysate or some of the other things we talked about. And again, be conservative with that and see what your results are, and maybe it's cutting down fertilizer by 50% and just see what your results are. Try to get a biological inoculant out there, but just dip your toe in and just every year move a little bit more. And if we work like that and we all help each other, regardless if you're using my system or somebody else's or whatever, it help each other, educate each other, and push each other to get better, but in a good way, in a supportive way. I think that's a hell of a lot better for soil conservation than this like feeling like, well, if you don't got a roller crimper and a no-till drill, then you might as well quit. Because
Right.
that really puts a lot of people on the outer edge. Like, I'm never going to have that.
Yep.
And I don't want people to feel that way. So if you have specific questions that, hey, how can I implement this on my farm or my piece of property? Give me a call, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to take the time to try to come up with a plan that's going to work for you, even if all you have is a rake and a hand broadcast spreader.
Yep. Yep. That's a fantastic point. I mean, yeah, like you said, you don't have to, jump in, head deep. You can make incremental, steps, like you said. They especially like if in regards to like especially those big time farmers, like they can't rip that bandit off and go cold turkey. Like they have to make a profit still. So they talk about that where some of these farmers, hey, start doing a cover crop. Start leaving. Don't leave your field bare. Put something on it. Have something green growing as much as you can, and then take steps from there. So they don't lose their production in the meantime because they gotta pay for the farm. So
Yeah,
that's a fantastic point that you brought up. That yeah, you don't have to jump in full with both feet right away. Just take it like you said, those incremental steps. Do your soil sample, and then see what you can make changes for 1 year, and then do another soil sample. See where you gotta do for the next year.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Ty, thank you so much for having me, buddy. I really, really appreciate it. It's always good catching up with you.
yeah, it's been great, man. Again, I love your videos, of course, and then yeah, if anyone's interested, check out vitalizeseed.com. I believe it is correct. Check out your
Sir. Yes,
product
sir.
and kind of what your philosophy is a little bit more depth. So thank you again, man. I'll let you go for the night, and it was great talking to you.
Likewise, buddy. Take care now.
All right, see you,
Bye
man.
bye.
All right, that is it for the conversation with Albert. Again, Albert, thank you so much for coming on. I was, really excited to be able to talk with you, to learn more about the relationship between, basically, the plants that we grow to the soil and the microbes in it, and how we can utilize that system. Kind of how like we closed out, where, it's not just about trying to grow a good food plot. Is being able to be able to grow either a food plot or a garden, or if you're doing agriculture and trying to get the most out of it, in regards to improving soil quality, to where you're having to use less inputs, saving money, saving on having to use synthetic fertilizers, ultimately saving on irrigation if need be. And then also the plants that you'll be growing are going to be more nutritious. So whether it's for human consumption or for animals, they're going to get more out of it, and ultimately be healthier, or be in better health because of it. So that's kind of what you end up going down that rabbit hole of you're not just doing a food plot because you just want to try to draw deer in. Then all of a sudden you are down this down this path of really trying to be, again, a conservationist in regards to the resources and, kind of in agriculture in general, trying to use best practices for your pocketbook as well as for the environment. So I'm excited about the new product that have or that you've released. It's something that, again, it seems like it's a very cost-effective way to just kind of help those microbes be able to start working with the plant, especially in a stage of either transplanting or a new planting on seeds. That just helps them make sure that that relationship between the microbes and the nutrients is working for them right off the get-go. So it seems like an awesome product that can kind of help jumpstart your, maybe get a plant off to the right, footing right off the get-go. So, and certainly too, Nitro Boost is for sale right now. So if you're thinking about, changing up what your seed is for the year, I'd highly recommend going with Vitalize seed. Again, it would be the Nitro Boost for the spring, and then you would turn around and terminate that towards the end of summer before your food plot program, and then you would follow up with Carbon Load. And again, you'll be very surprised that you can actually start to cut down on that fertilizer using that nutrient cycling. Where and as Albert said too, make sure that you do a soil sample before you're planting, so what type of amenities need to be made, and that way you're not offsetting that balance by adding too much nutrients that the soil may not need. And then also you'll be able to kind of plug those lowest holes in the bucket. That way your plants are a little bit more healthier, and ultimately you have a better program going forward. So again, if you're interested, check out what they have at vitalizeseed.com and see if that is the right program for your food plot system. And with that, that's a wrap. As always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.